So as you can see, it's a very, very complex issue, and as soon as you start to go down the rabbit hole, it's very difficult. But my biggest gripe is our scientific community and our educational system has utterly unprepared the American public for understanding even the skin of this issue. So that's where my frustration is. But let's throw it up to some questions, some more questions. Well, I would like people to begin to educate themselves on what the problems are and what the various solutions are, and to really raise these questions with the representatives to try to get some action and to break the industry influence over our government. We have too many, our whole system in every respect is geared towards short term rather than long term, towards the share cycle, the earnings cycle for corporations, the election cycle for our politicians. And that seems to me to legislate against any kind of investment in long-term solutions, which is why the example, why a centralized government, an autocratic government like China's can get things done so quickly. They don't have to be beholden to all these confused voices, but that's just verbiage. Go ahead. You have
It's all verbiage. I think that if I'm going to say that the few key things that are important from my perspective that are not necessarily from the film, but one is, I would say, absolutely completely reverse the balance of subsidies that are going into the energy sector, so that the vast lion's share is going to the renewable energy sector. So a massive injection of capital into the renewable energy sector. And then the second thing I would say is, I would actually say no new coal whatsoever, and let's start shutting them down. We've got a lot of our coal stock and our fossil fuel stock is aging, and a lot of them are going to need to have a huge injection of capital to retrofit to meet EPA standards that are nothing to do with CO2. And we have a great moment and opportunity there to take a really hard look at each of those plants and say, can we meet the energy needs that are being serviced by this plant another way? And I think, as Julio said, I think this has to be done plant by plant. This is not an overall, there may be a few that we have to keep going for a certain number more years, but I do think we need to be taking a really hard look at every single one. Yeah, I think it is about looking at every single plant and every single energy system we have, ecosystem we have, and really thinking hard about how we shift it away from fossil fuels and into renewables very quickly.
Yeah. Addressed about the risks or potential side effects of carbon capture and sequestration. I'm wondering what's known about risks in terms of geological instability and pollution or contacts with water in our aquifers or groundwater. Because it seems like water use is getting talked about here, but water pollution seems like it might be a victim of this process. And I'm just curious what research has been done, what you know about the risks, and what mitigation has been considered.
Thank you. Good question. The more that we've studied sequestration, the better it's gotten. When we started this, there was a whole bunch of sort of first order risks that we looked at, and we went, wow, it forms carbonic acid, maybe it'll dissolve the caprock, and that's a problem. Turns out it's the opposite. It makes the caprock better through time. And they said maybe well bores are a problem, it'll dissolve the cement of well bores. Nope, actually the opposite. It makes them better over time in general too. Maybe it'll induce earthquakes, and that'll be a problem. And the more we study it, it's like, nope, that's really not likely to be a problem. No, I don't. That's not going to happen. And so every time that we've had one of these what's a big risk sort of thing, it's turned out to not be a risk. The more we've studied it, the better we've gotten. The shortest version that I can use to answer your question, time's critical here, is if you have a good site to sequester, if you have a good sequestration resource, that part's going to work. And we have a pretty good idea of where those things are. If you have a bad site for sequestration, you can't make it better any more than you can create gold where there isn't gold. And as a consequence, you have to put a lot of effort up front, making sure that where you want to do this is in fact a good place. If it is a good place, then it's going to work, and it just becomes an operational management issue. And there are always operational management failures. I expect there to be a failure of some kind somewhere down the line when we deploy this thing at a big scale, but it will look a lot like everything else we do, and the risks will be negligible. The water risks in particular look very small. If the CO2 stays in the reservoir, which is the whole point, then the risk to shallow groundwater aquifers is basically negligible. The only other question is, in a place where you start having lots of injections, would you displace the deep brines into shallower levels? That's a good question, and we're working on it. Actually, the place that's working on it best is up the hill. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab is sort of the leader on that, and they're doing a fine job, and we'll learn more in a couple of years.
Incidentally, the Kerrs are gonna hold a press conference next week. Apparently, they just did receive funding to do tests on their land and water, and it does seem to implicate the CO2 injections there. I think it probably is a factor that injecting CO2 in for enhanced oil recovery in an old well site that is like a pincushion with old well sites, but we don't know what those results are yet, so, yes.
While the rest of the country was electing climate deniers, here in California we defeated Prop 23 with an amazingly diverse coalition, including hawks like Schultz, who is afraid of are becoming more dependent on oil, venture capitalists from Silicon Valley who wanted to support clean energy. Have any of you been looking at sort of the political landscape and how we might export some of the success we had in California throughout the rest of the country?
Most of the time, we see California as a leader in terms of progressive policy, and the rest of the country follows after the fact, which is everybody's hope of what's going to happen in the near future with the energy sector, because I think California's got the most impressive policy of any state in the country. And I do also think that with the most recent defeat of the proposition, what we saw was a really unusual alliance of different groups, which I think also is the future that we have to look to in terms of really pushing for progressive energy policy around the country. And I don't think that's just going to be around entrepreneurs with advocates. I think it's also going to mean really integrating the needs of economic justice and environmental justice as well, because actually we're able to have sustainable solutions to our energy problem and our climate problem if we don't deal with the massive poverty problems that already exist in this country. And so, and it's going to be really important to actually take a look at what kind of energy system can we create that's going to employ the most people, not just the energy solutions we can create that's going to pull the most carbon dioxide out of the air. Both things need to be addressed, and I think one of the reasons that this most recent fight was so successful is because groups really did make an attempt to join hands across a lot of different issue lines and said, oh look, we have a common enemy in this case. And I think we need to see that happening with the coal industry too, because while utilities can make changes with what the fuel stock they're using, and while banks can decide to finance something very different, we do actually have a whole industry dependent on continuing to dig coal out of the ground, and there's no question that they've got a stranglehold on Washington. And that one of the most important things that we can be doing, apart from reversing subsidies and massive injections of capital into renewable energy, is also trying to really break that stranglehold in Washington and really drive a wedge between our policymakers and our elected politicians and the coal industry. And that's a really complicated prospect, but it's one that the Rainforest Action Network is working on with a lot of our friends. So stay tuned. And I would also say that if anybody's interested in finding out more about RAND's campaigns on coal in particular, and we run forest campaigns and energy campaigns, particularly coal and oil, there are a number of campaigners who came tonight, and so maybe at the end I'll get them to put their hands up, and they're all tremendous people who can tell you a lot more about how you can get involved.
Sorry, if I could just add one small thing to that. I've always been amazed that environmental groups will pay for $2 million for an ad buy in San Francisco, where they've already won the war, and they won't pay $60,000 for an ad buy in the North Dakota Bismarck Chamber of Commerce. And North Dakota has just as many Senate votes as California does. And there are, small states that are very red, but actually run a lot of the relevant committees in government. And they're actually, often if you actually get a chance to talk to those people in the right context, they're like, yeah, we know this is something we can do, but I'm a Democrat who's running the state that's a state 70% registered Republicans. There's a limit to what I can achieve politically, and it's actually worth trying to. I was thinking about this. The climate bill failed in part because Byron Dorgan wouldn't vote for it, right? And the two senators in North Dakota wouldn't vote for it for good political reasons. The state has 600,000 people in it. Those two senators listened to maybe 300 people. You got to change 300 minds to get something done. There's 10 influential people in this country who can help shift the debate, and I don't think we've been arguing them hard enough. And there's something that can be done potentially that's of considerable interest in that context.
I agree.
So it seems like one of the fundamental difficulties with CCS is just the amount of energy required to actually capture and sequester the CO2. And the film estimated the energy penalty at about a third. And I'm wondering if, elaborating on Rebecca's question, if Dr. Friedmann could look forward and tell us about the technical potential for reducing that energy penalty.
Right. So right now, we do those kinds of gas separations at about 10% of the thermodynamic potential. We're leaving 90% of the exergy on the table. So there's a lot of room at the bottom to be reducing the costs. It's never going to get that much because there's an actual real engineering involved. But the idea that you can cut the energy penalty in half by 75%, that's actually in bounds. Our lungs do the separation today using 1/5 the energy of what you would use in a commercial plant. So we have an existence proof that this can be done in some, substantive and sustainable way. Right now, it's about a third of the energy of a power plant, kicking a round number. If you to retrofit a 1,000 megawatt plant would turn into a 750 megawatt plant. But with decent technology, you could get that up to 850 megawatts, 900 megawatts. You have to pay for compression. You're going to have to pay some energy for heat recovery. But you might only get away with a 10% energy penalty at the end of the day.
Quick question. We were discussing actually the difference between Europe and the US, and I was wondering, in the top-down approach that you seem to recommend, I think one of the major differences is we do have leaders that are not paying for their campaigns, so there is no private money in politics, and therefore it's more long-term. People are free, and politicians especially, to think about long-term and to force the business to actually adapt to the climate change, instead of being forced every 4 years to go and look around who is having some money from a company. We all know that energy that are not clean actually have way more money. So I was wondering whether one change that might be useful is actually not into the whole energy efficiency system, but as well the political system.
Yeah. And your point is?
And I'm pretty sure, since I've worked and lived in China, that the solution is not to go to a dictatorship, but rather to
Right.
As somebody who spent a lot of time in China, it has its own problems. There's reasons why we don't want to go entirely that way. I'm not going to actually answer your question. I'm going to deny the premise of the question and say something else. I have become very disappointed, I would say, with the way that the energy solutions are playing out in Europe. And credit to Europe. Europe spent the money and tried a bunch of stuff, which nobody else has done, so they get to learn first that their solutions don't really work for them. And Germany has made huge strides in wind power, but it cost them 37 cents a kilowatt hour to generate electricity, and they're having real stability problems with their grid. This is not an easy thing to fix. Spain is actually able to run on 20% renewable powers, but the way they did it is by having 100% overcapacity in their generation. They've built twice as much power as they need. This is the way that Europe's actually going after this. And one of the things that's unfortunate about this is that even when you take the money out of the political equation, you don't necessarily get the sense in. And we need to, though, at the end of the day, I want to back away from that a little bit. We need to actually be pretty tolerant of early mistakes. We're going to make a bunch of early mistakes. The power plant, which was allowing the Bright Source plant to get built, that was built in the 70s and 80s, was extremely expensive and a technical failure on many levels. But it enabled the technology to come. The same thing is true of all the windmills that are up there. We developed those in our country in the 70s, stopped developing them, and Denmark continued to do so and is reaping the benefits now. We actually need to pay for things like CCS to make the mistakes to learn whether or not this is actually a there. And it might turn out that CCS doesn't pay out. It just might not work. But other things that we think will work might not work either. The traveling wave reactor might not work. There's lots of things that might not work that look like good ideas now. And we have to be tolerant of the fact that we're going to try things that fail. That's not politically adaptive either.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jared with the California Energy Commission. So I kind of have a big background in energy issues. I know in the movie you showed several dots of coal generation in California. My understanding is we don't really have a lot of in-state generation in coal, although Southern California does contract with some out-of-state coal plants. So what's your view on being able to get California completely off coal? I think if we can start with our state, I would like to see that. Do you think that's viable?
Well, just because it's viable in California doesn't mean it's viable everywhere else in the U.S. Yes.
I would actually say that there's grounds in which that could be done in the state of California. And you can take SB 1368 and keep tightening up the ratchet until you actually get rid of all possible, coal plants on some level or another. I mean, there's a way that we could legislate that if we wanted to. Just know that that's going to cost more too. And the people who've looked at the sort of the integrated solutions piece say if you don't have CCS, the cost of total climate abatement goes up 50 to 80%. And it may be that in California, the cheapest solution gets rid of half the coal, but you still leave 10% of the grid on, and that's still cheaper, and you can still get to where you need to get. I sort of fervently believe that, to your question, if there's one thing that I could tell Congress, it would be leave no clean erg behind. We should really be very ecumenical, but we should be very serious about what we care about. We should set the targets that matter. If we think that a carbon limit of a certain level is the thing that matters, we should set that and keep it hard. Same thing with pollution limits, same thing with water use. Whatever the things you actually want to get at the end of the day, that's what you should legislate around. And ultimately, that's going to be a more resilient solution than other kinds of solutions we could pursue.
And I would just say that, I agree with what you're saying, Julio, but I would add that I think we can do it without CCS. And that CCS will actually be a lot more expensive a way to do it than alternatives that we can see. And I do think that California is well suited to this, particularly because of what you just said, in terms of we're not as dependent as other states are. And we can move ourselves off. We've got some good opportunities around, particularly, the fact that LA is coal-powered. How interesting would it be that a progressive city like that to actually take a look at their energy generation and move off of it, and what that would look like, and what example that can say.
They're moving off. They passed legislation. The city of Los Angeles is going coal-free in the
Really?
next 5 years. Yeah, really.
That's excellent. I didn't know that.
It's great.
So there's your answer.
Puts the go in Villaraigosa.
Sorry?
One more.
Yeah, one more question?
I heard something troubling from Severin Bernstein from the Haas School, I believe. He said that the price of coal and gasoline can drop down flexibly to the price basically just above extraction. So as solar becomes cheaper, wind becomes cheaper, or as a carbon tax is added, the price can adapt. So essentially, you're still going to use all of it. Maybe another country uses it, maybe it takes a little longer to use it, but it's all going to go up into the atmosphere. And to me, that was really a depressing thought. And I was wondering if you can offer any optimistic counterpoints.
Well, if we don't build any coal export terminals, then no other countries can have it. That's just a bit of foreshadowing.
So
why is Wyoming positioning itself to export?
What's that?
Why is Wyoming coal positioning itself to export from the West Coast?
Because it knows the writing's on the wall for coal in this country. And there's a big market. And so I think we need to actually really look carefully at that. We have a very big responsibility to shut off our coal use in this country, but we also have a big responsibility not to just push off our coal use in another country, which does mean taking a look at what are the coal companies planning on doing with the coal they're pulling out of the ground if they're not going to burn it here. And I think the reason they're looking to export terminals on the West Coast and on the East Coast is because they see the writing on the wall for burning the amount of coal they want to pull out of the ground in the U.S. Exactly. And so there's going to be a lot of people that have things to say about that, some of which are my good friends. And
so that's a social equity issue in other countries where the aerosol black carbon is melting the glaciers in the Himalaya faster and turns into a water issue there.
Yeah, but black carbon in a lot of that part of the world actually comes from two-stroke engines. And there's, again, good reasons why those are used in those part of the world. It's not for fun and profit, it's because it actually is an energy technology that works. I do want to speak just very briefly to your point, though. Historically, we've never used less of any kind of energy ever. We use more wood than we used to 100 years ago. We use way more coal than we used to use 20 years ago. if all new energy demand is going to double in the next 30 years, if all new energy demand is met with zero carbon sources, we still don't reduce our emissions. And currently the lifting cost for oil in Saudi Arabia is $1 a barrel. It's a hard incumbent to beat. So you actually have to decide that not that oil is bad, but that you want a clean atmosphere. And those are different things. They really are. And it informs the way that you think about these things politically, personally, and other kinds of things. It's part of the reason why this is so hard. All of the energy technologies start at a cost, and their cost decreases through time. And that makes them cheaper, and it makes their market penetration better. But all of the fossil energies started cheaper and have been getting cheaper through time too. And this is part of what's involved in all of this.
Well, are we out of time?
Yeah.
Well, you've been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you.